Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm the Dargafe Lazian, coming up in today's newscast. Israel's hospitals and clinics are on strike in protest over recent violent incidents against medical staff. Protests continue over the government's proposed legal reforms. How do they compare to the U.S. justice system, and will they really make Israel less democratic? And did you know that Israel has a football league of its own, and the popular American sport is now growing in popularity? Medical staff across Israel went on strike Monday in protest against recent incidents of violence against medical personnel. The Israel Medical Association announced a general strike which began at 7 a.m. Monday morning and saw all hospitals and clinics operating on a weekend schedule. The strike is slated to end Tuesday at 7 a.m. All medical services barring emergencies or specific departments such as oncology and dialysis units are participating in the strike. Last week, a 17-year-old patient at a women's health center in Ramle attacked a doctor with brass knuckles and kicked him in the head. Prior to that, a young couple attacked a pediatrician who was treating their child at the Soroka University Medical Center in Beersheba. This prompted a 2-hour strike at the medical center. The issue of violence against medical staff is not a new occurrence. The last government approved a budget to establish a police presence in hospitals across the country. But following these recent incidents, the Israeli Medical Association is asking for more measures to protect Israel's medical staff. And moving on, in a surprising report, the Biden administration allegedly now warning Israel against passing its pending court reforms. ILTV's Aaron Porras with the story.
New reports on Israeli media quoting anonymous sources from private meetings last week between Prime Minister Netanyahu and White House security advisor Jake Sullivan. While the topic not acknowledged publicly, the source saying that Sullivan told Netanyahu it would be hard to offer support to Israel should Jerusalem follow through with the bills. Further, Sullivan allegedly adding that, quote, the liberal democratic public in the United States and we in the administration do not like the direction that you're going in with regards to the judicial reform, end quote. Netanyahu, meantime, reportedly assuring that he would not pass the legislation as currently presented and would work to ensure a broad consensus across the Knesset. Foreign officials in power is not the only ones continuing to criticize the Netanyahu government's actions, though. Joining in now in popular Israeli protests against the government's judicial amendments, economics and banking leaders, as well as over 100 major businesses. Two former governors of the Bank of Israel, for example, Karnit Flug and Jacob Frenkel, warning Sunday that the overhaul would have a negative snowball effect, lowering Israel's credit rating and dealing a severe blow to the economy and Israeli citizens. In a joint op-ed, the pair alleging that, quote, the weakening of the judiciary system is expected to lead to a decrease in the willingness of foreign investors to invest in Israel and an increase in the cost of raising funds for the Israeli government as a result of the possible downgrading in the country's credit rating. Meantime, taking a more active approach, some 130 Israeli high-tech companies in Israel announcing a strike that will last for several hours on Tuesday, as well as additional demonstrations Thursday. This as a, quote, warning to the Israeli government that the regime change will not fly, end quote. The Joint Committee of the organizations writing that despite the economic costs, we are taking the first step to make it clear that the State of Israel will not be a dictatorship because it will not function for even a day without the central backbone of the Israeli economy and Israeli society. Proponents of the deal, however, dismissing the economic claims and continued to point to the court's overreach and activism as why it's necessary to pass these reforms. In fact, as similarly pointed out in a recent Wall Street Journal editorial, even the court's recent ruling to fire Aryeh Deri as a minister is reason enough to prove the need for improved checks and balances. This as the court ruled it unreasonable in the extreme to appoint Deri in light of his previous convictions, but could not point directly to any law that backed up their conclusions.
And joining us now with more on the legal reforms here in Israel is Rabbi Tuli Weitz, founder of Israel 365. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
So we're hearing of protests around the country, critics claiming that the legal reforms are endangering Israel's democracy. Is this criticism justified?
I don't think so. I think that the opposite is the case. Israel has a very robust democracy, and you have a new government that was just elected and demonstrates the will of the people. You have, for the first time in Israeli history, a majority religious government for the first time in right wing. And so the people want the government to pass the legislation that they've campaigned on. And for many years, you had a very secular and almost anti-religious government. So now for the first time, you have a religious and right-wing government, and you see this hysteria going on with protests that are expanding and expanding. The media seems to be really egging them on, and they are claiming to be protesting in favor of democracy, but in reality, we see here a very robust democracy.
Now, I want to touch upon an article that you've recently written where you call on the pro-Israeli Americans to closely pay attention to what is going on here in Israel with regards to the legal reforms. Why do you feel it's important that they take notice?
So Americans in general care very much about what happens in Israel. Israel and America are very close allies. However, for a majority of Americans who are Christian, Israel represents the biblical heritage that they value so much. And Jerusalem is a place that they care deeply about because the Bible tells them so. Jerusalem is the only city in the Bible that it demands our attention and even our prayers. It says in Psalms, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And so millions of Americans, in fact, pray every day for the peace of Jerusalem. There's this understanding that Jerusalem means the city of peace, Yerushalayim, the city of peace. And when Jerusalem is at peace and when Jerusalem is unified, so then the whole world will benefit. But when Jerusalem is disparaged like it is today, then the whole world will suffer, and Americans care very much about that.
Mm-hmm. Now, diving a little bit into the legal reforms here, if we want to compare them, for example, to the U.S. system of justice, aren't the reforms actually bringing Israel closer to the U.S. system of justice in terms of, for example, how we pick judges for the Supreme Court?
In America, you have the system of balances that has the three parties, where the Supreme Court, the judiciary, is independent of the Congress, and then there's the executive who gets to appoint the Supreme Court justices. Here in Israel, you have a very bizarre scenario where the Supreme Court justices appoint themselves. And there is no checks and balances like you have in America, which is why the government is looking to push for judicial reform, which a majority of the country wants. They elected this government. And again, it goes back to the Bible. I think that the Torah establishes a system of checks and balances as well. In ancient biblical times, you had, of course, a king, but you also had a priest and you also had a prophet. The king led the people to war, and the priests led the rituals, and then the prophet had to sometimes rein them both in when necessary, which the prophets often did. And so therefore, the system that you have today, where you have an unelected, undemocratic judiciary that is not it's an unfair system, it's not democratic, and it also flies in the face of the Torah principles.
Now, there does seem to be, though, a pretty broad consensus here in Israel that some reforms are needed, right? Even some of the politicians who are now marching in the opposition, in the protests, they themselves were calling for some kind of overhaul of the judicial system just a few months ago. But I think the question is of the scope of the overhaul. Do you think that perhaps maybe this government has taken it a little bit too far?
Well, I think that like governments, they need to negotiate, and in politics and in the Knesset, again, there's a very robust system of negotiation and compromise, which of course does need to happen. And that is happening, but this is the very first legislation that this new government is trying to push, and the response is hysterical. And I think that the media really needs to, and the external forces from other governments need to allow the government in Israel to do its thing and to negotiate, like you said, and to argue about the legal complexities. It is a complex legal issue for sure, but the level of hysteria is just out of control.
Now, we talked a little bit about the appointment of judges, but there is another clause that I want to talk about, which is unreasonableness, right? So In Israel, the Supreme Court has a lot of power, and it can strike down laws that they deem unreasonable. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that? And is there any other Supreme Court in the world that has this ability?
Well, it's interesting that because Israel doesn't have a constitution,